Hey there! In this skill builder video, I'm going to share with you how I machine bind my quilts. I love machine binding my quilts. Not only is it faster for me to machine bind the quilts, I love the texture of a quilt that's been machine bound. It's my personal preference. And if you're interested in knowing how I machine bind my quilts and my tips and tricks, this skill builder video will be just the thing for you. The process is really similar to traditional binding where you hand stitch the binding onto the back of the quilt, but I do a few things a little differently. I make my binding strip the same way. So one of the main things I do differently is I sew the binding onto the back of the quilt and then I turn the binding over and I finish it on the front. I like finishing it on the front because that way I can see and make sure that the fold of the binding lines up with the points on the quilt top. I especially love machine binding because I find that I can get some really nice mitered corners on my front of the quilt top. And instead of having to stop and start all the time, when I finish the front, it's just really one continuous stitching. I don't have to stop and start. It's just one continuous stitch. I love it so much, and I'm excited to share it with you here in this skill builder video. I'll show you how I have my sewing machine set up. So on my sewing machine, I've got my walking foot still. It is extremely valuable when machine binding. I have my stitch length set to a longer stitch length to match my quilting stitch length. So for me, I like to stitch with a longer stitch length on my quilting stitch length. So I've bumped up my stitch length to about a 3.5. And I like that so that my stitches on the binding will match the stitches on the quilt. I think it's a really nice touch. As far as thread, in this case, I'm going to use thread that matches the quilting thread that I use. So for this quilt, I used a dark blue-green thread. You can choose to have your thread match your binding, or you can choose to have your thread match the thread on your quilt top. It really depends. And in this case for me, I want my thread to match the quilting thread that I used in the quilt top. And I put my table on my sewing machine here just because it's easier to manage the quilt as it goes through the sewing machine when I have the table. To start with, you want to have your squared up quilt top and you want to start attaching the binding just like you would normally do when you're hand stitching your binding, but you want to sew it to the back side of the quilt. So I've unfolded my quilt here and I've put it right side down. And I've got the back side facing up. And I'm going to start my binding about halfway down one side. So I'm going to start unrolling my binding and I'm going to give myself about 8 inches. So just about 8 inches here. I'm going to start stitching right here. And I'm going to use this tail to attach the ends together. Okay, so here we go. So I'm going to start stitching. I'm going to stitch the regular way about a 1/4 inch away from the edge of the quilt here. And I'm just going to keep stitching until I get to the corner. Okay, I'm coming up to the corner and of course I've got one of the seam allowances, the seams on my binding strip at the corner. Of course, I forgot to check. I normally don't check and it normally happens to me at least once or twice in a quilt. So, well, I'm going to keep sewing. I'm going to sew up until about a 1/4 inch away from the second side here. Okay, so I've stopped stitching a 1/4 inch away from the second side. I'm going to back stitch a little bit. And forward stitch. I'm going to cut my thread and take out the quilt top. And then I'm going to miter this corner. So when I miter, it helps me to move the quilt top. So I'm going to pull up the binding so that this edge is nice and straight. And I'm just eyeballing it here. And then I'm going to fold it down so that this fold right here is in line with this edge up here. Then I'm going to move my binding back down here and I've got this edge, this fold lined up with this edge of the quilt and I've got this raw edge lined up and I'm going to keep sewing. Okay, so I'm going to keep stitching a 1/4 inch away from the edge of the quilt. All right, so I've come up to my next corner and I'm going to stitch until about a 1/4 inch away from the next side. I'm going to back stitch and forward stitch and cut. Okay, then I'm going to miter my corner. I'm going to pull out my quilt top so that it's lined up with my next side. I'm going to move my binding up so that the raw edges are lined up here. And then I'm going to move my fingers here because this is where I want the fold to go. I'm going to bring this down and my fold's going to line up with this side up here. And once I've got the raw edges lined up here and I've got my fold lined up here, I'm going to go back to my sewing machine and keep stitching 1/4 inch away. All right, so I'm going to keep stitching 1/4 inch away until I get to the next corner. Once you get to the corner, I'm going to keep stitching right until about 1/4 inch away and back stitch a little bit and cut. So to miter this next corner, I'm going to move my binding strip up so that these raw edges are nice and straight and lined up. And then I'm going to fold this down, and I want my fold to line up with this edge. And then I want to line up my raw edges to line up with my next corner here. And then I'm going to keep stitching and then back stitch and then cut. Okay, so to miter this last corner, I'm going to repeat the process. I'm going to move my binding strip up so that the raw edges are nice and aligned here. And then I'm going to put my fingers here so I can make a fold. And then I'm going to line up that fold with this edge up here. And once I've got the fold lined up here and my raw edges lined up here, I can continue to sew. Okay, for this last side, I stopped sewing my binding strip and I left this open about a good portion, I'd say almost a foot. And I want to give myself plenty of room to attach these binding strips together. So I'm going to show you how I attach these binding strips together. Okay, first off, I'm going to decide where I want to attach these. And I want to attach them right here. And so I'm going to trim off this portion right here. And I'm going to give it a trim nice and straight across. And then I'm going to unfold this here and I'm going to use this as my spacer. I want my second strip and my first strip to be about this distance apart. So I'm going to lay my strips on top of one another, make sure they're nice and straight with the binding here. I'm going to lay these right on top of one another, make sure everything's straight and flat. And then I'm going to line up my measuring little portion of fabric. And I've lined it up with the bottom, which is about right here. It's probably hard for you to see on camera, but this bottom strip is about right here. So I've lined up my new strip, this little measuring strip here. And I'm going to cut my second strip here. And then once I've got these lined up, then I'm going to pin them together. So I've got my strips ready to put together. They are about 2.5 inches difference. So I use my little measuring strip to cut the difference here. And what I need to do is I need to line these up right sides together in an L shape. So I'm going to unfold these and I'm going to line them up in an L shape here. So right sides together. And it helps if I can bunch up the quilt so it's not pulling. Okay, so I've got these lined up in an L shape and I'm going to add 3 pins where the stitching line is going to be. I'm going to sew along this diagonal right here. So there's 1 pin. I'm going to add the second pin down here. And then I'm going to add another pin. I'm going to add my 3rd pin in the middle. So this is where I've got it all pinned on the stitching line, which is going to be on the diagonal. And then before I stitch, I just want to act like it's bound already. And I just want to make sure that nothing is backwards or flipped. And it looks like we're good to go. Okay, so I want to finagle this back. So I've got my L. So I've got everything kind of situated just right. And I'm trying to use my hand almost like a pin. I want everything to be flat because I want this line right here, this area where I'm going to stitch, I want that all to be flat and fold free. So once that's all flat and fold free, I can stitch along that line from corner to corner. And again, this is where this washi tape is really going to help me sew a nice straight line. So I've got my needle down on the corner and I've got this corner right here. You can't see it because it's underneath the fabric, but it's lined up with this washi tape here. And once that's lined up, I can go ahead and stitch. Okay, I've got this line stitched, and my next step here is to remove the pins, and then I want to trim the seam allowance right here. And before I trim it, I just want to make sure, I just want to double check everything is situated right and nothing got reversed. And we are good to go, so I'm going to trim this seam allowance, and I'm just going to use my scissors this time. So then I'm going to line up the binding strip, what I've just sewn here, and I'm going to attach it to the raw edge. So I'm going to stitch 1/4 inch away from the edge of the quilt. And you'll notice I didn't even press this. I usually just finger press it, and finger pressing is absolutely fine in this situation. All right, I'm good. So I'm going to go ahead and finish attaching my binding strip to the back side of the quilt. So my next step is to turn the quilt right side up. So I want the quilt top facing me, and I'm going to start folding the binding strip towards the front, and I'm just going to stitch along about 1/8 inch away from this folded edge here. And that's going to finish up really nicely. I could start at the top here, but I want to start a little bit from the corner here because I want to go ahead and give my corner a perfect finish. And I found for me that starting a little bit further down away from the corner lets me get a perfect finish on my corners. So I'm going to start right here. All right, so zooming in here so you can see some details, I've got my foot down, and what I want to do first is I want to grab the top thread. I've grabbed my top thread here, and I'm going to needle down and needle up, and I'm going to pull up my bobbin thread and make sure that your foot is not on the pedal. So I've grabbed my bobbin thread and I've grabbed my top thread, and now I'm going to needle down again, and I'm going to move my threads behind the foot. And here I'm just going to do 1 back stitch or 2 back stitches. So now I've got my needle started, my sewing started. Now I'm going to continue sewing about 1/8 inch away from this folded edge. And as I'm coming up to the points by the perimeter of the quilt top, I'm doing my best to line up the folded edge of the binding with the points on the quilt top. So here's another point right here. So I'll be sure to line up that folded edge with that point on my quilt top. Okay, so I'm coming up to this corner, so I'm going to show you how I miter these corners. So as I approach a corner, I get the next side ready. So I've got this side ready down here, and then I fold down the corner right here. So I've got this corner ready to go through the sewing machine right here. And this is where you might want to have a stiletto on hand. And actually I need to get a little bit closer. So I'm going to keep stitching. And as I get really close, as my needle gets really close, I'm going to replace my finger with the stiletto. And that's a little safer, right? And once I get my needle right in that fold, I want to rotate my quilt top so that I can sew the next side. And once I've got the quilt top and the binding lined up, then I can keep sewing. Okay, I'm going to keep stitching 1/8 inch away from the edge of the fold in my binding until I get to the next corner. Okay, so I'm getting close to my next corner, so I want to get my next side ready. I'm folding the next side in, and then I'm going to come over here to the corner over here, and I'm going to do my miter. And then I'm going to keep sewing a little bit longer, and then once I get really close, I'm going to replace my finger with my stiletto here. Okay, so I'm really close, so I'm going to replace my finger with the stiletto. And I'm going to sew right up onto that miter. So I've got my needle down through both of those pieces of fabric, both folds of the binding. I'm going to turn my quilt so that I can sew the next side. All right, so now I'm gonna put my foot down and I'm gonna keep sewing 1/8 of an inch away from this folded side. Okay, so I'm getting close to my next corner, so I'm gonna prep that corner. So I'm gonna fold up my next side. I'm gonna fold the binding in toward my quilt top. And I'm gonna fix the miter here. I'm gonna do the miter nice and tight right there. I'm gonna hold it with my finger until I get too close, and then I'm gonna replace my finger with the stiletto. Okay, I'm getting pretty close here, so I'm going to replace my finger with that stiletto. And I'm going to sew all the way up to that corner and so that I get both parts of the fold. Okay, and once I've got both folds in my miter, I can turn my quilt top and keep stitching. Okay, I'm coming out on my last corner here, and I've saved the hardest for last because I've got that seam in my binding strip here. So I'm gonna have to be a little bit more careful here. So I'm gonna prep my binding on this side. So I've got it folded in toward the quilt top, and I'm gonna draft my miter here. And I've got that seam right in there, and it's not giving me too much trouble here. So I'm gonna keep stitching until I get really close, and then I'm gonna replace my finger with the stiletto. Okay, we're getting pretty close, so I'm going to replace my finger with that stiletto. Okay, once I've got my needle through both sides of the binding, I can turn my quilt. Keep your needle down. This is my last side, so I'm going to stitch up to here, and then I'm going to back stitch where I started. Okay, I'm going to back stitch. And cut, and I am done. So my last step here is I'm going to trim these threads. I'm not going to knot them off because they're already knotted off. I'm just going to cut them really close. And then I can turn it over and I can cut these threads as well. All right, and after you finish that last corner, you are finished with your quilt, and that is the best feeling, right? It's the best feeling. Now you can take it out of the sewing machine and really start to feel that nice quilty texture. Okay, that is all for me today. Thanks so much for watching. I will see you next time. Bye for now.